we discussed in one of the sessions that how urbanization is actually demographic mobility. So when we are talking about mobility, and also what Gorky Chakraborty had said about concentrating that mobility into one space, that space compression, and so that the productivity goes up of that space. So that is where all the models are focusing on. So we have a larger structural model that gets imposed onto a particular urban space. So I think that is the issue that a lot of us are grappling with as well. So when I'm talking about urban space, so the first issue that usually comes up in terms of urban space is how there is congestion within the city, how there is a compression, how there is too many residential areas, that's why it leads to encroachment, then that needs to be, those populations need to be evicted. So that is what usually it comes down to. It boils down to what the space is. So when we are talking about urban space organization or reorganization through these models of planning and implementation, we look at space as an entity which needs to be upgraded, which needs to be developed, right? So when we are talking about urban development, the focus usually is on infrastructural development, and that is where the role of, like we saw, how the role of financial institutions, whether it is international or even the local political nexus, comes into play. It's the infrastructural development. So where does this idea of infrastructural development, like how do we look at it, or where does this idea come from, or what is the approach to infrastructural development? So just to give you a sense of what I'm saying, I'll just give a brief snippet of one of the case studies that I had done on a wetland area called Solabil in Guwahati city. So there has been a lot of work done on Deeporbil because it's a Ramsar site, and a lot of contestations around that, a lot of ecological and environmental issues around that. But what we are not focusing is that there have been other wetlands in Guwahati as well, right? And the wetland that I picked up is located right in the center of the city. It's close to Polton Bazaar, which is one of the busiest areas in Guwahati, and it's one of the most interlinked places because there's the bus station, then it expands onto Panbazar's railway station. So there's a lot of mobility in that place. So how does an urban common feature in the centrality of the city? So that was my rationale for selecting this particular wetland. So when I started looking into Solabil as a wetland, the initial understanding of that area, of the people who are living in that area, is that it's an urban common, it's a common resource, right? So when we're talking about a common resource, we do not immediately look up to the government to take care of it. It's a communally owned property resource, so everyone is obligated in certain ways for taking care of it because they are also utilizing it. So when we're talking about urban common, and when Solabil was treated as an urban common, it was a stormwater reservoir then. So whenever rainfall, like we used to have heavy rainfalls in Guwahati, the water, because I think we've already discussed how Guwahati is a bowl shaped, so the areas, the wetland areas, are actually the collecting places where the water comes down and it collects there, and from there are channels of drainages which connects it to the larger river system. Like how we talk about Brahmaputra is not an isolated river, it's a river system. So it gets connected through various channels to that system. So that is why before we didn't have such huge issues of flood, which is now one of the most pressing issues in urbanization, because these wetlands were in such places that water had the place to go out, or the channels were there. So that was the purpose that Solabil also served. It was an urban common which the local people were utilizing, but at the same time it was contributing to a larger picture in dealing with the problem of issue or heavy rainfalls. Now, when the first impact of urbanization was felt in Solabil, when the revenue department started giving land allotments to people around the region, around the Solabil. So now the rationale for giving out these land documents is that an urban common is a public space. So everybody has access to it. So we can come up with, like it shouldn't be located in just one particular region or locality utilizing the resource. So it has to be opened up to more people. So that is how, land allotments were given out for the purpose of expansion and growth of the city, which came down to impinging on those wetland areas around the wetland. So the moment the urban common turned into a public space, that is where the role of the state came in. And with the coming of the state, what happened is, so just to read out few things. So on So when after the revenue department started giving out allotments, land allotments, the Unnayan committees, the development committees of that region, because of that locality, because they are more aware of what the wetland represents, they filed a petition against the revenue department's land allotments. So eventually there was a stay order, and it was that no more further land allotments can happen. But by the time that went into the court and that direction came in, it was already late, because the wetland had already lost out a major section of its wetland area. So the issue that I was grappling with here was that how, as an urban common, it had more utility, but once it was appropriated into a public space, how that utility was redefined and how that created a problem. Okay, so that is when I started going back to reading about public spaces and how do urban commons feature in the larger realm of public spaces. So our development paradigm, when we talk about urban development or public development, it's such a ubiquitous word, no? It's such a vague term that it's for the larger good of the public. I think I had raised this question, I think in Chandan sir's presentation only, that when we are talking about state public private partnership, where is the public? So that is the question that I'm dealing with, that where is the public in the public space? Because when we are redefining public spaces, then we see that it's a larger model that is imposed onto it. Just to give an example, how smart cities come up, or how new parks come up, and what even Honja Barbara sir was saying in the morning, that how pay and use entry, so how it restricts certain accessibilities. The thing is, we have been discussing about larger models at the macro levels, but it's difficult for us to grapple with such macro structures. So I had to reflect back to think, where is the intervention point? Where do I start, or where do I stand in terms of understanding this process? So what through readings and through these conversations, what I realized is that there is a problem in terms of how we look at space. So when we're talking about, even when we are intervening, the language it's for the public, it's for public use. But who determines what is the public? That is the main question that came up. And usually the places that come around the whole paradigm of public development, these are larger models which have already been worked somewhere else and have been imposed, saying that these are the facilities which will lead to the development of this public. So to take the case study of this urban common, so it was an urban common, and it was fulfilling the purpose that it was there for, as a natural water reservoir, or even for the livelihood of the nearby communities. The moment it was appropriate to a public space, how all of that utility got disrupted. It was no longer serving as a reservoir, nor was it connected to the drainage system, nor was it giving any consideration to the livelihood of the people around the wetland. So in this context, David Harvey also speaks about the difference of our approach through public space and how we need to shift it to a more urban common governance. So why he picked up this issue was that when we are talking about public space, so public space is basically a model where the state is the public representative, right? So whatever we believe or we understand, that is represented by the state. But the state is not, like I think Krishna has also said, it's not a monolith. And there are major nexuses, like whether it is political nexus, whether it is the economic nexus, whether it is the larger macro structures. So it is something very intangible. Like we don't know how to deal with that macro structure, because we deal with that one issue and we realize there are so many complex layers to it. So we just give up, like there's nothing that can happen beyond this. So here what Harvey suggests is that in order to deal with this kind of structural inequalities, there has to be a systemic shift in how we look at space itself. So rather than believing in the system of welfare state, rather than believing in the system of public space, which is a formal equality model, it's for everyone, we need to shift to the perspective of utilization of space. So coming from ownership, from capital accumulation and ownership of spaces, how that shift needs to happen to utilization of spaces when we are planning a city. Okay, so when I'm talking about utilization of spaces, it might seem a little arbitrary because every pocket has different utilizations of spaces. But this is a model that is coming up because at least in that structure where we do not even find a space, here is a space for intervention when we are talking about utilization of space, where it comes back to the ground level. Otherwise, when we talk about planning, we straight away go to government offices. That planning starts here, government offices. Like she was also saying that Mandal is the starting point. Why does that happen? That happens because we are arguing in the model of public space, that we want land for public space, or all the development projects are for the public. So the public has become, in our understanding, it might be representation of us, but how the public itself has become very skewed, no, the understanding. So a shift needs to happen from our interventions as well for public space to urban commons, like how it has to be grounded in reality. Okay, so again, to go back to Guwahati city, to give you an example, another example. So when the capital shift happened from Shillong to Guwahati in 1972, the entire Dispur area, which is now the capital complex, Krishna has also mentioned that how so much land was appropriated, de-reserved for the capital complex. And eventually, ultimately what happened, the reality at the ground level is something else. It's not the entire 7 lakh bighas approximately is not the capital complex. Ultimately, it comes down to a very small, like 40 bighas. What happened to the rest of the land? So that guise under which the development paradigm is presented, that it's for public development and public use, needs to be questioned. Because public use is not, it's not an overall umbrella that everyone has the same public utility for a particular space. So when we talk about playgrounds, and there's a distinction between playgrounds and parks that has come about, right? So playgrounds are open spaces and parks are those government managed spaces which are openly accessible to everyone. So now with this kind of a conception, the problem is that the government is deciding who's the public when they're putting up gated parks and gated communities. Even though it might seem like, oh, accessible has become easier, that people can come in, but it's actually creating a divide. So to go back to the example of the capital complex, so what happened when the capital shift happened is the land was de-reserved, but the capital complex came down to a very small portion of the land. The rest of the land was appropriated in order to facilitate the administrative class that came along with it. And these people were not living here. So this was to facilitate the development of the capital complex. So the people who were living there are various tribal community villages who were living there in that area. So that was largely an agricultural belt. So one of the communities that I had interacted with was the Caribou communities living in the Hangrabari region, close to Dispur, part of that circle. So their narrative, the problem I had was that their narratives were not present anywhere when we are trying to understand land use. What happened to their understanding, their processes of utilization, which did not have such a huge impact on the larger urbanization, right? So, and it gets reflected in how they even give names to those places. Like Hangrabari before was known as Polo Khaiti. Okay, so Polo Khaiti, just to break it down, so Polo means fishing nets. And Khaiti means basically the fishing nets would like get eroded or broken down because there was such a big wetland area, there was such a big lake area that they used to go to fish there. The fishes were so big on which their livelihood depended. The fishes were so big, when they were fishing it out, their nets would break. That was how it was an ecologically viable area, that area. In the name itself, you can just relate to the name itself and you realize what this land or what this space represents. That narrative completely disappeared. So also another example is, so in terms of public appropriation of space, another example is, so in Hangrabari area itself, there's a small hillock which now the public health department is there. So that hillock was again for public use. It was appropriated for public use. But ultimately, yes, it is public use because there's a government office. Okay? But what in reality happened was, now the people who were staying there, the Caribou community who were staying there, who had easy access to these wetlands or hillocks because it was part of their sustainability, they became the encroachers. So they were the ones who were displaced because the development model paradigm like imposed a larger plan onto that process without taking into account what is the actual utilization of that space, what is the purpose of that space, how are the people utilizing it. So this is one narrative that gets lost in terms of when we're talking about in terms of planning or development models. So my approach was just how to bring back those narratives, not really looking for a solution or an answer, but how to bring back those narratives into the fold. So I started looking at spaces in terms of the value that we associate with space, not monetary, not capital value, but just social value. How do we associate space with social value? So when we talk about social value of a space, it gets grounded to the reality of the utilization. It's not about just ownership of land anymore. Like when we talk about ownership, then we have to think about, when we talk about ownership, it again goes back to that public private model, no, who owns the land and all of that. Rather than focusing on the ownership of land, the focus in terms of planning also needs to shift to the utilization of land. That is how we can bring in the narratives. And in order to look at those narratives, how there's a new approach, urban commons approach, that's a new model of governance that's coming up, that even if we can't deal at these macro structures, there is a space for narratives through this approach where we can focus on the utilization of a space, and rather than interrogating public space and holding the government or the state responsible to give us public spaces or equal access to everyone, we should be focusing on the substantive equality. Who actually requires those spaces? How do we build around that idea of utilization of space in that located in the physicality of space? So rather than trying to interrogate macro structures and through the prism of neoliberalism, it's an abstract idea. We can't deal with it at that level because we are not equipped. So the process I did was just to unpack it a little bit and just to try and figure out where is the intervention point, where do we bring in those narratives. So this is a model, this is an approach, it's not a model, it's an approach which can be, and the difference between model and approach I think we know, because models are imposed and approaches can come from different spaces to be incorporated within those models, existing models. And there are places for flexibility. For instance, when Trishna was also presenting, she spoke about the mandal. So the mandal is not a bureaucrat, right? So that can become a starting point of intervention. Like, how does a mandal view space? Or how does a mandal get to understand the social value of a space? So that shift of focus, I think that is what is missing in terms of our planning. Rather than looking at it through the prism of public space and formal equality, we should try to address these structural inequalities through the prism of utilization of space. The state's role, we shouldn't just hold the state accountable to give us provisions for everyone, but rather provisions where it is actually required. So to bring in those narratives, I think would bring forward a more interrogative approach towards the whole system of urban planning, which seems like a monolith, but when broken down into components and basic concepts, I think we can intervene on those ground level realities if we just find those points of intervention. So yeah, also one more thing. So when this whole distinction that I'm trying to bring forward about public space, or not me, basically David Harvey and other people who are trying to bring about in terms of urban space and urban commons, public space and urban commons, is that we can't deal with bureaucratization of space or privatization of space on a larger scale because it is a large structure, right? It's an absolute structure where we don't know what the intervention point is or where do we begin. So what happens is that it is a very intangible form of inequality. Like the structural inequality is very intangible when we are talking in terms of structures. So this intangible idea of inequality gets translated to a more tangible space when this distinction between urban public space and urban commons is viewed. So the bureaucratization of the entire process is reflected on a particular space. That how, when it was an urban common, it had lesser value because it was just located to one specific locality. But when it is of public use, it has more value. That is how real estate develops around a region. So that lens, that focus of that lens is on public space, right? So when we are talking about public space, how that itself distorts the idea of public or who's actually utilizing those resources. So that is the approach that I'm trying to understand, that how through urban commons approach, how urban governance through an approach of urban commons, how it can maybe provide a space for these narratives and can become more inclusive in that sense. What I've been trying to understand, that how there can be a shift in terms of approach, and also one thing, when we think about urbanization advancing in such a rapid phase, and we think that it's overwhelming because it's progressing too fast. Well, one thing I don't remember now which session, I think Gorky Chakravarti's session only, where he said that it's actually a very eventual process. We realize it now because it's hitting us now. But the socially marginalized have been going through this process since industrialization. So it's a gradual process. We realize the impact of it because now it's come to the middle class and the cities. It's hitting us now. So it's not that interventions cannot happen because it's such a fast-paced progress. But interventions can happen. We just have to understand the process itself and how the focus, if with a little shift of the focus, maybe even the way we approach the subject can be different, I think. So there are books that are coming up. So Urban Commons model was basically an economic model when it started out. And there's Elinor Ostrom who got Nobel Prize for that model and everything. So it was an economic model. Again, the problem is when we're talking about economics, it seems like for us, it seems like, again, human beings are turned into numbers. How do we understand and apply those models? But what we saw in the documentary yesterday, that, that right to the city, the claiming of spaces, that is how it can be appropriated, because this space for intervention, it gives narratives to the region-specific narratives. It's not an overall model that the narratives are also going to be similar everywhere. So that is the point where Urban Commons approach brings it down to ground reality. So that is the space for narratives, that is the space for, even if we fit into a larger macro structure, how we can actually incorporate the regional specificities. And more specifically in the context of Northeast India or Guwahati, we as a region have a history of common property resources. Right? So it's not very difficult to think, to go back to those kind of models of governance, but with a more structured format. So when we're talking about common property resources, those resources were not owned by anyone. Those were again based on utilization, common utilization. And that model or that approach was very viable because it provided for the people who were utilizing that space, as well as it had a larger contribution of connecting to the greater city. So if we can just take a step back, and rather than getting lost in these larger models and structures, if we can just take a step back and understand the concepts and interrogate those concepts through which we are also questioning these, I think that helped me in terms of reflection. So rather than even when I started out, I was thinking of looking at urban spaces and public spaces, but how the term public spaces itself is so loaded and how it has changed through the process of planning, I think that needs to be interrogated. So that is where there could be multiple models or multiple approaches, but this is one of the approaches that is coming up of urban governance through the concept of urban commons. So how we look at the city as a common, not just specifically, wetland area or hills, but the whole conception of city as a common, as an urban common. And if we, even in terms of planning, if that kind of a systemic shift happens, when we look at the city as a common, we're not just demanding the state for our public utilities or facilities or amenities. We are also accountable for it. So that accountability from our side as well has a space in that narrative when we bring in this kind of an approach from the ground reality.